This is the empty Gal4 controls, P, BDP, Gal4U, crossed to white plus trip. And what you can see is when I first bring flies into the warm room that have been freshly tapped into this chamber, they're running around a little bit frantically. So typically in about the first 30 seconds, they're quite hyper, and you see a little bit of jumping and flight. You'll occasionally see flies pop out of the video frame. But typically after the first 30 seconds or so, the flies calm down a lot, and you won't see a lot of jumping or flight, but they'll still walk around a fair amount. Flies will also groom a fair amount when they're tapped into a new environment, so you can see maybe a few examples of grooming. I haven't seen any. Oh, here's an example of wing grooming, but you can see that not every fly is grooming all the time. And to some degree that depends on how wet the fly food was that they came off of. So grooming is fairly variable. Some of the things that you can notice are this is a female here with black stripes across her abdomen, but not a big black area across the back of her abdomen, as you see in this male that I'm now putting in the center. And if you look at a male upside down, you can see that the end of his abdomen is black, and that's the male genitalia, and the end of a female abdomen is not black. The females are also a little bit larger. The abdomen shape in a female is this typical sort of rounded oval, and in a male is a narrower oval. You'll see examples of phenotypes in other lines where the abdomen can be more pointed or more rounded, but this is what normal abdomens look like. In normal flies, you don't typically see their neck. So if you look at the fly that I'm holding in the center right now, you can see the neck occasionally if the fly bends its head forward to groom, but for the most part, the head looks quite close to the thorax. The wings are typically held in a nicely folded position where they're not completely overlapping, but largely overlapping. And if you look at them from the side, they're held quite horizontal to the body. And in other lines, you may sometimes notice flies where the wings are held up or held down or flapping or flicking. Here you can see that it's not all that common to do any wing movements, except occasionally in the context of flight.
Let's get the stance as they walk around.
The stance of these control flies is that the legs are held out at a position that I would say is about 200% of the body width altogether. And you can see if you watch carefully that the flies are walking on the tips of their legs, not on the other joints. And that if you look at a fly side on, let's see if we can find one, you don't typically see the legs folded with the joints pointing at too acute of an angle. Sorry, I'm not finding a good example of that. So the angle of the joints is more sort of quite an open angle. But there are examples of lines where the stance is much more narrow, the feet are held closer to the body, and the joints, let's call it the elbow, is more pointing up in the air.
You mentioned the angle of the body.
So a normal fly typically walks with its head a little bit higher than its abdomen, so its abdomen is a little bit closer to the ground. So I would say that they walk with their body held at maybe, let's call that a 15-degree angle. You can see that the social interactions of flies are that they prefer not to stand on top of one another or bump into each other. So if they get too close, you'll see a little bit of a leg flick or a push with one leg to try to avoid walking on each other. So they have some degree of social inhibition that keeps them, that gives them personal space and keeps them sort of at a distance from each other. But although they may do this little bit of a leg push to maintain personal space, you don't frequently see aggression in control flies. So you don't see them tussling actively or boxing each other or doing too much pushing and shoving, except just to maintain this space around them. Likewise, you don't see very many courtship interactions in controls, and in fact, it's almost never the case that you would see courtship in these controls because the females are not virgins. I'm going to zoom in and try to get an example of what the labellum looks like. So now let's move on to talk about the proboscis. So if you look at a fly that's standing still, you can see the proboscis in the front of its face, but you can see that it only protrudes a tiny bit. That's the labellum at the end of it, so the lips of the fly. And that is normally held in a closed position. So unlike human lips that have a horizontal line in them, the fly lips essentially have a vertical line in them. So when they open their lips, it's opening to the side. Sorry, it's hard to find. So you may sometimes see flies that are holding their labellum open or that are opening and closing it repeatedly. But this gives you a little bit of a sense that that the normally the labellae are held in the closed position.
Very zoomed in. Let's go on to the antennae.
So you can also see the antennae here are held quite close to the head. They are not sticking out considerably, although you can see them protrude beyond the head, but only by, let's say, I don't know, about 10% of the head's width, and they're not sticking out at a great angle. What haven't I covered?
Walking and melting.
Walking. What did I want to say about walking?
Backward, sideways.
Oh, right. So I'm going to zoom back out and say that typically flies would almost never have a reason to walk sideways or backwards unless they're trying to get away from each other. So it's almost always the case that the flies walk forward or turn, but it would be unusual to see. That was an example of solid defecation there. So here, if you look on the ceiling, you can see one piece of solid poop that I'll put in the center of the field right now. And now I'm moving for the center of the field. You can see a dried spot of liquid excrement. So flies are capable of both solid and liquid defecation. Although it doesn't happen with great frequency, as you can tell from looking at the surface here, you can see spots of poop. And this was a freshly cleaned chamber when we brought them in, but it's not absolutely obscured with poop. Flies typically do not move their head in these controls. So if you watch how a fly's head is held, you can see that they will sometimes tilt it forward for the sake of grooming it, but you don't see head movements normally, so head shaking side to side or up and down. I'll zoom back in and try to show male terminalia. That may be hard, but there you go. Okay, so the male genitalia, they can actually extend the claspers, and normal flies you don't see that very often. So here, so the end of the male abdomen is just sort of flattened, rounded, but then terminating in a sort of flattened area, and it's possible to see phenotypes where instead the males actually extend their terminalia.
I think the last thing would be do a zoom out for an impression of the overall level of activity.
Oh, I should also mention that it's possible to sometimes have developmental defects where the wings would be an altered shape. So here you can see that the wings are very clear and smooth and oval, but it's possible to see wings that are crumpled or sort of more translucent instead of clear and shiny. The overall level of activity has now settled down a bit. So after the first 30 seconds or so, when the flies were running around a lot, you can see that they're still moving a lot, occasionally standing still, but pretty rarely doing flight or jumping now. I should mention that we looked at the labellum at the end of the proboscis. You may also notice that you don't you almost never see proboscis extension in these control flies in normal conditions. And if there were proboscis extension, you'd be able to see it both, usually from any view, dorsal or ventral or side-on views. So in control flies, you will occasionally see proboscis extension, usually in the context of grooming, but not for sort of and just random reasons.